The room was filled with laughter, luxury, and perfect smiles, until a 2-year-old child broke the silence with a single word that no one was prepared to hear. In front of powerful guests and polished lies, a baby reached out to a woman everyone else ignored. What he felt, what he remembered, threatened to expose a truth buried by wealth, status, and quiet discrimination. This wasn't just an awkward moment at a rich family's celebration. It was a mirror held up to a reality many choose not to see. What could a child possibly know that adults spent years hiding? Before we go on, if you're new here, subscribe to Stories of Racism and connect with us for daily powerful stories. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Tomorrow, I've got something extra special for you. Before that night, life inside the Ashford mansion moved with quiet precision. Everything had its place. Every person had a role. The house did not run on warmth. It ran on routine, hierarchy, and unspoken rules that everyone learned quickly or paid for silently. Marcus Ashford had been born into this world of order and expectation. At 32, he carried the weight of a legacy built on hotels, influence, and appearances. His days were filled with boardrooms, flights, and meetings that blurred together. Success followed him everywhere, but so did absence. Since the death of his wife, his home had become a beautifully furnished shell, grand, impressive, and emotionally hollow. He told himself that providing security was enough. That love could wait. His son, Sebastian, was too young to understand wealth or grief. At 2 years old, his world was smaller and simpler. He noticed who held him when he cried. He remembered who sang to him when the nights felt long. He felt comfort without questioning whether it was allowed. In a house filled with staff, only a few faces had ever truly mattered to him, but those faces were easily replaced, or so the adults believed. The Ashford household depended heavily on its workers, though they were rarely seen as anything more than background. They moved quietly through hallways, blending into the walls, expected to serve without leaving emotional footprints. Attachment was discouraged. Boundaries were strict. Care was permitted, but only to a point. Beyond that point, it became inconvenient. Marcus's mother, Patricia Ashford, had ensured those boundaries remained firm. She believed order was kindness and distance was protection. Emotions, especially from those beneath the family's status, were viewed as dangerous. Over the years, staff came and went with little explanation. Life moved forward without pause. Then there was Victoria Sinclair, elegant, ambitious, and carefully polished. She entered Marcus's life at a moment when he was vulnerable and lost, offering clarity, direction, and control. She fit perfectly into the Ashford image. The engagement party was meant to confirm that perfection to the world. It was a statement of renewal, power, and continuity. Inside the mansion, preparations for the celebration were flawless. Crystal lights reflected off marble floors. Guests arrived dressed in confidence and wealth. Everything appeared seamless. But beneath the surface, old decisions lingered, unresolved, unacknowledged, and quietly waiting. Earlier that day, a new maid had arrived for her first shift. She wore the uniform, followed instructions, and kept her head down. To most people in the room, she was invisible, just another worker, another replaceable presence. No one asked about her past. No one imagined it mattered. But normal life has a way of cracking when truth is buried too deep. In a house built on silence, memory does not disappear, it waits. And sometimes, the smallest voice is the one that carries it back into the light. What was supposed to be a perfect evening was already tilting toward something no one could control. Because before the night was over, a child would recognize what power tried to erase, and the cost of that recognition would be impossible to ignore. As evening settled in, the mansion seemed to hold its breath. Staff members moved with rehearsed efficiency, adjusting table settings, refilling glasses, smoothing out details no guest would ever consciously notice. For them, this night was work, another long shift under watchful eyes. Mistakes would not be forgiven. Emotions would not be acknowledged. In homes like this, service was expected to be flawless and invisible. Marcus drifted through the rooms, greeting familiar faces, exchanging polite laughter, playing the role everyone expected of him. To the guests, he was composed and confident, a man who had survived loss and rebuilt his future. But beneath that calm exterior, there was a distance even he did not fully understand. He loved his son without question, yet his love had been expressed through provision rather than presence. He trusted systems, schedules, and people chosen by others to fill the spaces he could not. Sebastian, meanwhile, moved through the evening unaware of its significance. He didn't understand why so many strangers wanted to touch his hair or smile too close to his face. He didn't know why his clothes felt stiff or why the music was louder than usual. He only knew when something felt familiar and when something felt wrong. Children carry memory differently. They don't organize it with logic or status. They feel it. Across the room, the new maid focused on her tasks, careful not to draw attention. She kept her eyes lowered, her movements precise, blending into the rhythm of service. For someone like her, this job represented survival, not opportunity. There was no room for mistakes, no space for curiosity. She understood the rules before anyone explained them. Speak only when spoken to. Do your job. Do not exist beyond it. Victoria watched everything with calculated awareness. She noticed when a server stood too close, when a laugh sounded out of place, when a moment threatened to drift from her control. To her, this night was about order, about proving that the past had been neatly closed and replaced with something better. She believed that stability came from eliminating what complicated life, not from confronting it. Patricia Ashford moved through the crowd like a guardian of tradition. She had spent decades shaping this world, protecting it from what she considered weakness. In her mind, hierarchy ensured safety. Boundaries ensured respect. Compassion, when misplaced, led to disorder. She had made hard decisions before and never questioned them, because questioning would require accountability. What none of them considered was how unresolved moments linger. How love, once given, does not vanish just because it becomes inconvenient. How people who are silenced still leave echoes behind. The mansion had seen many celebrations, many carefully staged events meant to project success and unity. But this night carried something different beneath its surface. A tension that hadn't yet found words. A truth that had waited quietly, growing heavier with time. Everyone believed they were in control. Everyone assumed the past had been handled, erased, dismissed. They were wrong. Because sometimes the calm before the moment isn't peace. It's the final pause before something buried rises to the surface. And when it does, it doesn't ask permission. The moment Sebastian's cry cut through the ballroom, the carefully choreographed evening began to unravel. What had been background noise, music, laughter, the soft clinking of glasses, collapsed into an uneasy stillness. Eyes shifted. Smiles stiffened. The kind of silence that follows a mistake no one knows how to correct spread through the room. Marcus felt it immediately. Not just embarrassment, but something deeper, an instinctive warning that this wasn't a simple tantrum. He had seen his son cry before. Hunger, fatigue, frustration. This was different. This cry carried recognition, urgency, need. Sebastian's small body strained toward a single point in the room, his attention locked onto someone the rest of the guests barely registered. The maid. To most people there, she was just part of the machinery that kept the evening running. A uniform, a role, someone meant to blend into the edges of the celebration. But Sebastian didn't see her that way. His reaction disrupted the invisible line the household relied on, the line separating those who mattered from those who were meant to remain unseen. As whispers began to ripple through the crowd, Marcus's focus narrowed. He followed his son's gaze and saw the woman standing frozen near the service entrance. She looked younger than he'd expected, her posture tense, as if she'd been caught somewhere she didn't belong. Her eyes were fixed on Sebastian, wide with something Marcus couldn't immediately name. Fear, yes, but also restraint. The kind that comes from knowing you have no right to speak. The imbalance of power in the room was unmistakable. 50 guests dressed in wealth and confidence. One woman in a maid's uniform, isolated by status before she ever opened her mouth. And yet, The center of gravity had shifted toward her. Victoria sensed it too. She tightened, scanning the room, calculating how quickly things were slipping. This was not part of the plan. Engagement parties were meant to signal control, stability, and a seamless future. What was unfolding threatened all three. She moved closer to Marcus, her presence sharp, corrective, urging him without words to restore order. But order was already failing. Sebastian's reaction refused to soften. His distress didn't fade under soothing gestures or familiar faces. The harder the adults tried to redirect him, the more insistent he became. His small hands reached out again and again, bypassing wealth, bypassing authority, drawn to something that felt safe to him. Guests began to lean in, curiosity replacing politeness. In rooms like this, discomfort was entertainment as long as it didn't belong to them. The narrative was already forming in their minds. An awkward moment, an embarrassing lapse, something to whisper about later. But beneath that surface curiosity was something darker, the unspoken judgment of a servant who had overstepped without ever being told how. The head housekeeper moved quickly, attempting to solve the problem the way such problems were always solved: removal. The maid was no longer a person in distress. She was a liability, a disruption, a threat to the image being sold that night. Hands reached for her arm, guiding her away as if erasing her would erase the problem. That was when Marcus hesitated. He didn't fully understand why. Maybe it was the look on his son's face, raw and unmistakable. Maybe it was the maid's expression, caught between panic and heartbreak. Or maybe it was the sudden realization that this moment had nothing to do with misbehavior and everything to do with memory. As attention turned fully toward them, the room's power dynamics hardened. Patricia Ashford moved forward, her presence commanding, her composure intact. She had dealt with situations like this before, quietly, efficiently. In her world, complications were handled, not examined. Staff were managed, not listened to. Her gaze passed over the maid without recognition, the way one might glance at furniture out of place. The assumption was clear. This would end the same way all uncomfortable truths ended in this family: silenced, dismissed, forgotten. But the maid didn't disappear. Instead, something shifted inside her. The fear remained, but beneath it surfaced grief that had nowhere left to go. She looked at Sebastian with an intensity that made the air feel heavier, thicker. Years of restraint pressed against the moment, threatening to break through. The injustice of it all began to surface, not in speeches or accusations, but in contrast. A child allowed to express attachment freely. A woman punished for the same instinct. Care celebrated when it came from wealth, condemned when it came from service. As fragments of the past started to emerge, the crowd's mood changed. This was no longer a simple scene of a spoiled child or an incompetent worker. Patterns began to appear. Decisions made quietly. People removed without explanation. Lives redirected by authority that never had to justify itself. Marcus felt the ground shift beneath him as he realized how little he knew about what had happened in his own home. How easily he had accepted explanations that protected comfort over truth. How his absence, had allowed others to control the narrative of his son's life. The maid's presence became a mirror, reflecting choices Marcus had avoided examining. The room, once filled with certainty, now held unease. Every polished surface seemed to hide a crack. Victoria's composure thinned as the past refused to stay buried. The future she envisioned depended on clean lines and closed chapters. What was unfolding threatened to expose that those chapters had been torn out, not finished. And through it all, Sebastian remained fixed on the woman he recognized, not by title, not by uniform, but by feeling. As the tension climbed, the realization became unavoidable. This night would not end quietly. Someone had been wronged. Someone had been erased. And the truth, once seen through a child's eyes, was no longer willing to stay invisible. The question was no longer whether the truth would come out, but how much it would destroy when it did. The longer the moment stretched, the more uncomfortable it became for everyone involved. What should have been resolved in seconds now lingered, heavy and unresolved, forcing people to confront something they were used to stepping around. In a space built to celebrate power and unity, cracks were forming where no one expected them. Marcus felt eyes on him from every direction, not just curious glances but expectant ones. He was the authority here, the decision-maker, the one meant to restore calm and move things along. For years, he had been praised for decisive leadership, swift actions, clean outcomes. Yet now, faced with a situation that could not be solved with money or dismissal, he hesitated again. The maid stood rigid, her shoulders squared as if bracing for impact. She had learned long ago what moments like this usually meant. Removal, accusation, quiet blame. No explanation would be requested and none would matter. In houses like this, intention was irrelevant when compared to perception, and perception had already turned against her. Whispers grew louder, sharper. Some guests assumed incompetence. Others assumed manipulation. A few assumed desperation. Very few considered the possibility that something deeper was at play. That assumption itself was part of the injustice. How quickly people assigned motive to someone without power, without ever questioning the system surrounding them. Patricia Ashford's voice cut through the murmurs, calm but firm, urging resolution. Her words carried decades of influence. She framed the situation as a simple misunderstanding, an unfortunate disruption caused by misplaced familiarity. In her view, this wasn't cruelty, it was order. An order she believed justified itself. But order had a cost. The more Patricia spoke, the clearer it became that what she called boundaries had always been enforced unevenly. Emotional attachment was acceptable when it served the family's needs. When it came from someone paid to care, nurture, and love on command, that same attachment became a threat. The message was unspoken but unmistakable. Affection from below was inappropriate. Love had a rank. Marcus felt that realization settle uneasily in his chest. He began to understand that the injustice in front of him wasn't an isolated event. It was a pattern. One reinforced quietly over time, protected by silence and convenience. He had benefited from it without ever questioning it. Sebastian's presence made that impossible now. The child watched the adults with wide eyes, sensing tension without understanding its source. He didn't know about status or hierarchy. He didn't recognize uniforms as markers of worth. He responded to familiarity, to care remembered in his body rather than his mind. His reaction stripped away the social masks everyone else wore. And that terrified them. Because children don't play along with polite lies. As the maid's connection to the past became harder to dismiss, a new kind of tension emerged, one rooted in accountability. If her story was true, then someone had made a decision that caused harm. If harm had occurred, then responsibility followed. And responsibility was something no one in that room wanted to claim. Victoria sensed the shift and responded with urgency. Her tone sharpened, her patience thinning. She reframed the situation as instability, casting doubt on the maid's credibility. It was a familiar strategy, questioned the emotional state of the vulnerable to protect the powerful. The implication was clear. This woman could not be trusted because she felt too much. The accusation landed heavily, echoing a broader injustice. Emotional expression, especially from those with less power, was treated as evidence of unreliability rather than humanity. Pain became a flaw. Grief became a liability. The staff watched silently from the edges of the room. They had seen versions of this before. They knew how it usually ended, but something about this moment felt different. The presence of the guests, the involvement of a child, the refusal of the situation to shrink back into silence. When one voice from the staff spoke up, the balance shifted further. It wasn't loud or dramatic, just steady and certain. A confirmation of what had happened before, a reminder that memory exists beyond official records, that stories don't disappear just because they are inconvenient. The room reacted instantly. Surprise, disbelief, unease. The narrative was no longer controlled by one family, one version of events. The injustice was no longer speculative, it was corroborated. Marcus felt the weight of it press down on him. He could no longer pretend ignorance. The realization that decisions had been made in his name, affecting his son and others, without his knowledge or consent shook him deeply. His silence had enabled harm. His absence had allowed authority to operate unchecked. And still, the maid said very little. Her restraint became its own form of testimony. She didn't plead. She didn't accuse. She stood there carrying the burden of a story she hadn't been allowed to tell, waiting to see whether this house would repeat its pattern, or finally break it. The guests began to understand they were witnessing more than a family dispute. This was a confrontation between appearance and truth, between comfort and conscience. Some shifted uncomfortably, realizing their own complicity in systems that relied on silence. Others grew defensive, eager for the discomfort to end. But the moment refused to dissolve. Because injustice, once exposed, demands response. Marcus faced a choice he could no longer delay: restore order by repeating the past, or disrupt it by acknowledging what had been done. The decision would not only define the night, but reshape the lives bound to it. As the tension reached a breaking point, one thing became clear: whatever happened next would leave no one unchanged. The celebration had already been lost. What remained was the reckoning, and the truth that had waited patiently for a child's voice to bring it into the open. The air in the ballroom felt heavier with every passing second, as if the walls themselves were absorbing the tension. Conversations had stopped completely now. No one pretended to sip champagne or admire the Dacre anymore. This was no longer background drama. It had become the event. Marcus noticed how the guests' expressions had changed. At first, there had been curiosity, then discomfort. Now, something closer to judgment, not toward the maid alone, but toward the family that had built its reputation on control and refinement. He understood, perhaps for the first time, how fragile that reputation really was. Sebastian's cries softened into quiet sounds, but his focus never wavered. He leaned forward whenever the maid shifted, his small fingers curling as if reaching for something just out of grasp. That persistence unsettled the adults more than the crying ever had. It was one thing to dismiss noise. It was another to dismiss recognition. The maid's composure began to crack, not in chaos but in exhaustion. Years of holding herself back pressed against the surface. She had entered the house that day with one goal: to see that the child was safe. She hadn't planned for this, hadn't planned to be seen, and yet being seen now felt unavoidable. Marcus began asking questions, quiet ones at first, then firmer. Questions that should have been asked long ago. Each answer exposed another layer of neglect, another decision made without regard for consequence. The more he learned, the clearer the pattern became. What had happened wasn't accidental. It was systematic, a removal of inconvenience disguised as professionalism. Patricia's authority, once unquestioned, began to falter under scrutiny. Her responses grew shorter, sharper. She insisted on intention over impact, order over empathy. But the room no longer accepted those explanations so easily. Too many pieces were falling into place. Victoria, sensing the shift in power, became more rigid. She spoke of boundaries, of image, of what was appropriate. Her words revealed more than she intended. In her urgency to protect the future she envisioned, she exposed how disposable the past, and the people in it, had been to her. The injustice deepened not because of what was being revealed, but because of how long it had been allowed to remain hidden. Staff members exchanged glances from the edges of the room. Some recognized the story instantly. Others recognized the fear. They had all learned the same lesson in different ways: care deeply, but never too deeply. Love the work, but not the people. Cross that invisible line and you would be erased. Marcus felt a growing sense of shame, not only for what had happened, but for how easily it had happened without him noticing. He had trusted that systems worked, that people acted in good faith, that silence meant nothing was wrong. He saw now how that silence had protected cruelty. As voices overlapped and tension escalated, the celebration dissolved completely. Music was cut. Staff stopped moving. The illusion of control was gone. What remained was confrontation, raw and unavoidable. And still, the most powerful presence in the room said nothing. Sebastian watched. In his quiet attention was a kind of judgment no adult could argue with. He didn't understand explanations. He didn't care about justification. He only knew who had been there for him, and who hadn't. That simplicity stripped away every excuse. Marcus realized then that this was no longer about a past decision or a single act of discrimination. It was about the future, about whether this child would grow up learning that love could be erased by status, that people could be discarded once they became inconvenient, that silence was safer than truth. The rising action reached a point where retreat was impossible. Whatever choice Marcus made next would ripple outward, through his family, his reputation, and the lives of those who had been treated as invisible for far too long. The room waited. Because moments like this don't come often, and when they do, they demand something more than comfort. They demand courage. The tension no longer belonged to a single corner of the room. It had spread, touching everyone present. Even those who wanted no part of it could feel the weight of what was unfolding. The celebration had become a reckoning, and no amount of wealth or etiquette could soften its edge. Marcus felt caught between two worlds colliding in real time. One was the life he had inherited, polished, protected, and built on unchallenged authority. The other was unfolding in front of him now, messy and human, demanding acknowledgement. For the first time, he saw how easily comfort had blinded him, how silence had allowed others to make decisions that reshaped lives while he remained conveniently distant. The injustice revealed itself not as a single cruel act, but as a chain of small, deliberate choices, decisions justified as necessary, emotions labeled unprofessional, people reduced to roles, then discarded when those roles became inconvenient. It was discrimination not shouted aloud, but enforced quietly, through hierarchy, fear, and control. Around the room, reactions fractured. Some guests leaned away, uncomfortable with the realization that they had witnessed versions of this dynamic in their own lives and chosen not to intervene. Others stiffened defensively, unwilling to accept that something so ugly could exist beneath such elegance. A few watched with sharp interest, recognizing that power was slipping and wanting to see who would claim it next. The staff remained still, eyes lowered, bodies tense. They understood what was at stake better than anyone. This was more than one woman's story, it was a test. A rare moment when truth had reached the surface in front of witnesses. If it was buried again, the message would be clear. Nothing had changed. Sebastian's presence anchored the moment. He was calm now, observing with a seriousness that felt far beyond his age. In his quiet focus was a reminder that the harm had already occurred. No decision made tonight could erase the past. It could only determine whether the future repeated it. Marcus sensed that everyone was waiting for him, not for a speech but for a direction. His next action would either restore the familiar order or dismantle it. There would be consequences either way, public, personal, irreversible. The room held its breath, because this was the moment when systems either defend themselves or finally admit they are broken. And once that admission is made, there is no returning to the comfort of pretending nothing was ever wrong. The room no longer felt like a ballroom. It felt like a courtroom without a judge, where everyone present had been forced into the role of witness. The chandeliers still glowed overhead, but their light seemed harsher now, exposing rather than beautifying. Every polished surface reflected tension instead of elegance. Marcus stood at the center of it all, his pulse loud in his ears. For the first time in his life, money offered him no protection. Authority gave him no script. This was not a crisis he could delegate or silence with a check. This was personal, and it was public. Across from him, the maid stood motionless. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't demanded justice. She hadn't even stepped forward. Yet somehow she had become the most powerful presence in the room, not because of what she did, but because of what had been done to her and how calmly she carried it. Marcus looked at her again, really looked this time. Not as staff, not as a complication, but as a human being who had walked into a room knowing she would never be treated as an equal and came anyway. And then he looked at his son. Sebastian was quiet now, too quiet. His small body rested against Marcus's shoulder, but his eyes were fixed on the woman across the room, not confused, not scared, just certain. The certainty of someone who had loved without permission and remembered without shame. That was when it hit Marcus with brutal clarity. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't coincidence. This was memory colliding with denial. The realization struck like a physical blow. His chest tightened. His breath shortened. He understood now that whatever choice he made next would define more than this night. It would define who he was willing to be when comfort and conscience stood on opposite sides. Patricia Ashford stepped forward. Her heels clicked sharply against the marble floor, a sound that had once signaled authority. For decades, that sound had meant order was about to be restored, but tonight it landed differently, heavier, hollow. She spoke with controlled precision, the way people do when they believe restraint is the same as righteousness. She framed the situation as disruption, as inconvenience, as something that needed to be corrected immediately before it spread further. Her words carried a familiar logic, one Marcus had accepted his entire life without question. Control the narrative, remove the problem, protect the image. But now, standing in the middle of the wreckage that logic had created, Marcus heard something else beneath her words. Fear. Not fear of disorder, but fear of exposure. Because if this moment was acknowledged, then others would follow. If this woman was allowed to be heard, then others would remember. And if remembering became acceptable, then silence, the foundation of their control, would collapse. Victoria moved next. Her voice was sharper, more urgent. She spoke of instability, of boundaries crossed, of how dangerous it was to allow emotions to override structure. Her words were polished, practiced, and cruel in their efficiency. She didn't deny what had happened, she redefined it. She implied that care, when it comes from the powerless, is suspicious. That love, when it comes from someone without status, is a threat. And Marcus saw it clearly now. This wasn't about the past. This was about preserving a future built on the same injustice. The guests shifted uneasily. Some looked away. Others leaned in. Phones remained lowered, but attention was fully locked. Everyone knew they were witnessing something irreversible, the kind of moment people later describe as when everything changed. The staff stood frozen along the walls, their silence heavy with meaning. They knew this moment intimately. They had lived versions of it in smaller rooms, without witnesses, without consequences for the powerful. This was the first time the pattern had been exposed under light too bright to ignore. Marcus felt anger rise, slow, deliberate, and unfamiliar. Not explosive rage, but something colder, more dangerous. Anger at himself, at the years he had been absent, at the explanations he had accepted because they were convenient, at the way he had allowed grief to become an excuse for disengagement, at the realization that his son had formed his earliest understanding of love with someone the family later erased without a second thought. He understood now that injustice doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it wears professionalism. Sometimes it hides behind policy. Sometimes it speaks softly and calls itself protection. Sebastian shifted in his arms, his small hand clutching Marcus's suit jacket. That simple gesture grounded him, reminded him that this wasn't abstract, this wasn't symbolic, this was about what his child would learn from this moment. Would Sebastian learn that love is conditional, that people can be removed once they become inconvenient, that silence is safer than truth? Or would he learn that power can be challenged, that humanity matters more than image? Marcus lowered his voice and spoke. Not loudly, not dramatically, but firmly enough that the room leaned in. He asked for space. That alone sent a shock through the crowd. No one had expected him to pause the machine instead of restarting it. No one had expected him to resist the instinct to erase the problem. Patricia stiffened. Victoria's expression tightened. The staff held their breath. The maid looked up for the first time. Their eyes met. In that brief moment, Marcus saw everything he had missed: the grief, the restraint, the courage it took to stand there knowing how easily she could be dismissed again. And then, just as he opened his mouth to speak again, Sebastian did something no one expected. Something that would make it impossible for anyone in that room to pretend this was still just a misunderstanding. Something that would shatter the last remaining barrier between denial and truth. Sebastian slipped from Marcus's arms before anyone could stop him. It happened quickly, too quickly for protocol, too quickly for control. His small shoes touched the marble floor, and he moved with unsteady determination across the open space of the ballroom. Gasps rippled through the guests as the child crossed a line no one else dared to step over. Toward her. The maid instinctively stepped back, panic flashing across her face. Years of conditioning screamed at her to retreat, to disappear, to make herself smaller. This was not allowed. This was dangerous. This was how stories ended badly for people like her. But Sebastian didn't stop. He reached her, wrapped his arms around her legs, and pressed his face against her uniform as if he had done it 100 times before. The room froze in collective shock. No whispers now, no movement, just the sound of a child breathing, steady and sure, as if he had finally found what he had been looking for. Marcus felt his heart slam against his ribs. This wasn't memory recalled. This was memory lived. The maid's body trembled. Her hands hovered uselessly at her sides, unsure whether she was allowed to touch him. She looked up at Marcus, fear and apology written across her face, as if she expected punishment for a crime she hadn't committed. But Marcus couldn't look away. Because in that single, unfiltered moment, his son had done what none of the adults had the courage to do. He had chosen truth over permission. Patricia stepped forward sharply, her voice cutting through the silence. She demanded that the child be taken away, that this stop immediately. Her tone was not cruel, but it was absolute, the voice of someone accustomed to obedience. But no one moved. Not the staff. Not Marcus. Not even the guests. Something had shifted too far. Victoria followed, her composure finally cracking. She spoke of embarrassment, of appearances, of how this would look. Her words came faster now, sharper, as though speed could still outrun reality. She framed the moment as chaos, something to be corrected before it damaged what mattered. What mattered? Marcus realized with startling clarity that her definition of what mattered had never included the people who made their lives possible. It had never included the woman standing frozen in front of him. It had never included the emotional world of his child, only how that world reflected on her. The injustice was no longer theoretical. It stood in front of them, undeniable. A child clinging to the one person who had given him comfort when no one else was watching. The maid finally knelt, slowly, carefully, as if every movement required permission. She didn't pull Sebastian closer. She didn't claim him. She simply placed one hand on his back, light as air, the way someone does when they are afraid even tenderness might be taken away. That restraint shattered Marcus, because it revealed the deepest cruelty of all. Not that love had been punished, but that it had been trained to apologize for existing. Marcus spoke again, louder this time. He asked questions that could no longer be ignored, not accusations, questions. When had the nanny been dismissed? Who made that decision? Why had he never been informed? Why had security been instructed to deny access afterward? Each question landed like a stone dropped into still water, rippling outward, touching every corner of the room. The answers came reluctantly, unevenly, but they came. And with them came the full weight of what had been done. A woman had been removed not for wrongdoing, but for caring too deeply, for forming a bond that made others uncomfortable, for loving a child whose family believed love could be regulated, rationed, controlled. And then she had disappeared. No farewell. No acknowledgement. No closure. The room absorbed this truth in real time, and with it came a new kind of silence, one filled with recognition. Not sympathy, recognition. Because many in that room had benefited from similar silences elsewhere. Different houses, different names, same rules. Marcus felt something break open inside him. Not loudly, not violently, but permanently. He looked at his mother, really looked at her, and understood that her certainty had always been built on distance. He looked at Victoria and saw not a future partner, but a continuation of the same system that had already caused harm. And then he looked at the maid again. For the first time, he addressed her directly, not as staff, not as an inconvenience, but as a person whose pain had been deliberately minimized. The entire room leaned in. This was the moment everyone would remember. Because whatever he said next would not only determine how this night ended, but whether justice would finally be allowed into a space that had spent generations keeping it out. Sebastian lifted his head and looked up at Marcus, eyes wide and trusting. And in that look was a question no adult could avoid anymore. Marcus took a slow breath. The kind that comes when a person realizes there is no version of this moment where everyone walks away satisfied. Only versions where the truth is faced or buried again. He felt the weight of every eye in the room, but for the first time, he didn't feel ruled by it. He stepped forward, not toward his mother, not toward Victoria, toward the maid. The room reacted instantly, sharp inhales, subtle gasps, the quiet shock of seeing a line crossed that had always been enforced without question. He lowered himself to one knee, bringing himself level with her, with his son, with the truth. That single movement said more than any speech ever could. Marcus spoke clearly, steadily, so that every word reached the farthest corners of the ballroom. He acknowledged what had been done, not softened, not reframed. He named it for what it was: wrong, a decision made in the name of order that caused harm, a choice that valued image over humanity. The injustice was no longer hidden behind policy or tradition. It was spoken aloud, stripped of its excuses. Patricia's face hardened. For the first time, her authority found resistance not from rebellion but from moral clarity. She tried to intervene, reminding Marcus of reputation, of legacy, of what the family had built. But her words no longer held power, not when said against the quiet reality of a child clinging to someone he trusted. Victoria's silence was louder than anything she could have said. The future she envisioned, controlled, curated, unchallenged, was slipping away, and she knew it. The carefully maintained image she had invested in was unraveling in front of witnesses she could not dismiss. Marcus made a choice. He rejected the version of the world where love was a liability. He rejected the idea that care from the powerless was something to be erased. He rejected the silence that had allowed harm to pass for professionalism. He declared that the woman standing in front of him would not be removed, not now, not quietly, not ever again. Gasps filled the room. Because this wasn't just an act of compassion, it was a rupture in the system, a public refusal to continue benefiting from injustice, a moment where power chose accountability instead of comfort. The staff felt it immediately. Some straightened. Some exhaled for the first time all night. They understood the significance of what was happening. This wasn't about one person. It was about whether the rules that governed their lives were finally being questioned. Sebastian released his grip just long enough to look up, then reached out again, this time holding both Marcus and the maid. In that small gesture was something profound. A bridge. A future not built on erasure. Marcus announced that the engagement party was over. The statement landed like a final gavel strike. Guests began to stir, unsure how to respond. Some looked stunned. Others looked relieved. A few looked angry, but no one argued, because deep down everyone knew the celebration had ended the moment truth entered the room. Victoria turned away without a word. Patricia remained frozen, confronted with a reality she could no longer control. The legacy she had guarded so fiercely was changing, not through force, but through acknowledgement. Marcus stood holding his son, his posture different now, lighter, straighter. He had chosen to see, and once seen he could not unsee. The maid wiped her face, not with relief, but with disbelief. For someone who had spent so long being silenced, being heard felt almost unreal. The room slowly emptied, leaving behind what wealth could not erase: accountability. And as the doors closed and the chandeliers dimmed, one truth remained unmistakable. This wasn't the end of the story. It was the moment everything finally began to change. When the last guest left the mansion, the silence that followed felt heavier than the chaos that came before. The music was gone. The laughter was gone. Even the chandeliers seemed dimmer, as if the house itself had absorbed what had happened and did not know how to return to normal. Marcus remained standing in the center of the ballroom, long after the doors closed. For the first time in years, there was nothing demanding his attention. No schedule, no investors, no applause, just the truth. And the truth did not rush him. It settled in slowly, forcing him to feel every part of it. He carried Sebastian upstairs himself that night, not because there were no staff available, but because he needed to. As his son slept against his shoulder, Marcus replayed the evening again and again. The moment he had ignored, the decision he had allowed others to make, the silence he had mistaken for peace. He understood now that absence can be as damaging as cruelty. Downstairs, the maid, still wearing the same uniform, sat quietly in the staff room, unsure what came next. Years of experience had taught her not to trust sudden shifts in power. Promises had been made before, only to disappear once attention moved on. Even now, after everything, she expected the cost to arrive later. But something was different. Marcus returned. Not with lawyers. Not with instructions. But with honesty. He didn't ask her to explain herself again. He didn't demand proof. He acknowledged what should have been acknowledged long ago, that harm had been done, and it had been done under his name. He admitted that his privilege had insulated him from consequences, while others carried them alone. That admission mattered more than any apology. Because in systems built on inequality, acknowledgement is the first thing denied. The days that followed were not clean or simple. There was no instant redemption. Ending the engagement sent shockwaves through social circles and business partners alike. Whispers turned into headlines. Some praised Marcus's decision. Others accused him of weakness, of letting emotion override reason. He accepted all of it. For the first time, he understood that doing the right thing does not come with universal approval, especially when it disrupts comfort built on injustice. Inside the mansion, changes began quietly but deliberately. Rules that had once enforced distance were questioned. Policies that treated care as a liability were rewritten. Staff members noticed the difference not in grand speeches, but in small moments, being addressed by name, being listened to, being seen. And yet Marcus knew this was not enough. Because one corrected household does not undo generations of harm. Late one evening, he sat alone in his study, reviewing old records, not financial ones but personnel files. Names, dates, abrupt endings with vague explanations. He realized how many stories had been cut short without acknowledgement, how many people had been removed because they reminded the powerful that humanity cannot be neatly controlled. The weight of that realization stayed with him. Sebastian, meanwhile, changed in quieter ways. He slept better, laughed more freely. The tension that had lived beneath his confusion began to lift. Children feel justice even when they don't have language for it. They sense when something wrong has been corrected and when it hasn't. Marcus watched his son closely, aware now that the lessons Sebastian absorbed would shape the kind of man he became. He understood that parenting was not about protection alone. It was about modeling courage, about showing that silence is a choice and not a neutral one. The maid did not disappear from the story. But her future, like the future of many who live under systems of inequality, remained uncertain. Healing did not erase grief. Recognition did not undo loss. What had been taken from her could not be fully returned. And that truth lingered. Because resolution does not mean everything is fixed. Sometimes it means everything is finally seen. Marcus began to understand that racism and class-based injustice do not always announce themselves loudly. They exist in quiet decisions, in who is believed and who is dismissed, in who is allowed to love freely and who is punished for it. What happened in that ballroom was not an exception. It was a revelation. And as the days passed, one question followed Marcus everywhere he went. If this could happen so easily here, how many times had it already happened elsewhere, unseen? In the weeks that followed, the Ashford mansion became quieter, but not calmer. The silence was different now. It wasn't the controlled quiet of obedience or fear. It was the uneasy stillness that comes when people begin to question things they were never supposed to question. News of the broken engagement traveled fast. Some stories were generous. Others were cruel. Commentators debated motives, speculated about scandal, reduced a deeply human reckoning into something consumable. What few of them talked about was the woman at the center of it all, the one whose life had been shaped by a decision she never had the power to challenge. That omission was familiar. Marcus noticed it immediately, how easily conversations shifted away from harm and toward reputation. How quickly people reframed injustice as drama when it disrupted wealth. He saw how the same systems that had silenced the maid now attempted to erase her again, this time by focusing on him. And for the first time, he refused to let that happen. He spoke publicly, not in grand speeches but in deliberate, uncomfortable honesty. He did not portray himself as a hero. He described himself as complicit. He talked about absence, about silence, about how privilege allows injustice to operate smoothly because those protected by it rarely feel the consequences. The response was mixed. Some applauded his transparency. Others accused him of exaggeration, of turning a private matter into a moral spectacle. A few insisted that the situation had nothing to do with discrimination at all, that it was simply about professionalism, boundaries, how things work. Marcus recognized those arguments immediately. They were the same ones used everywhere to excuse inequality. Inside the house, staff conversations changed. People spoke more openly, cautiously at first, then with growing confidence. Stories emerged, small moments of humiliation, quiet dismissals, warnings delivered without witnesses. None of it was dramatic enough to make headlines. All of it was heavy enough to shape lives. The maid listened to these conversations more than she spoke. Her grief remained personal, her loss unchanged. Being acknowledged did not bring her sister back. It did not erase the years of feeling powerless. But it did something else. It broke the isolation. For the first time, she was no longer carrying her story alone. Marcus began to understand that accountability is not a single act, it is a practice. It requires staying present even when attention fades, especially when attention fades. Justice loses its meaning when it only exists under a spotlight. Sebastian's world expanded in subtle but important ways. He spent time around people without hierarchy dictating affection. He learned names. He learned that care could come from many places, and that respect was not something given only upward. These lessons did not come from lectures. They came from observation, from watching adults choose differently. Marcus knew that this was the most lasting impact of all. Because racism and inequality are not inherited through hatred alone, they are passed down through normalized silence, through what children see adults tolerate, through what is left unchallenged. As months passed, Marcus found himself unable to return to the version of life he once accepted. Business decisions felt different. Conversations carried more weight. He began asking questions he had never thought to ask before, not because he wanted credit, but because he could no longer accept ignorance as innocence. He realized something crucial. One moment of courage does not dismantle a system, but it can disrupt it. It can create space for others to speak. It can make silence harder to justify. And slowly, outside the walls of the mansion, echoes of that disruption began to appear, not as sweeping reform, not as sudden change, but as conversations, as discomfort, as people recognizing pieces of their own lives in a story they had initially dismissed as distant. The maid eventually chose to leave the house, not because she was pushed out, but because staying no longer felt necessary to prove anything. She carried her sister's memory with her, not as something stolen, but as something honored. The difference mattered. Marcus watched her go with a deeper understanding of loss. Some wounds do not ask to be healed in the same place they were created. The mansion continued to stand. The business continued to operate. Life moved forward. But something fundamental had shifted. Because once injustice is seen clearly, it changes how everything else is seen too. And Marcus knew this truth would follow him forever. He could never again claim he didn't know. In the weeks that followed, the Ashford mansion became quieter, but not calmer. The silence was different now. It wasn't the controlled quiet of obedience or fear. It was the uneasy stillness that comes when people begin to question things they were never supposed to question. News of the broken engagement traveled fast. Some stories were generous, others were cruel. Commentators debated motives, speculated about scandal, reduced a deeply human reckoning into something consumable. What few of them talked about was the woman at the center of it all, the one whose life had been shaped by a decision she never had the power to challenge. That omission was familiar. Marcus noticed it immediately. How easily conversations shifted away from harm and toward reputation. How quickly people reframed injustice as drama when it disrupted wealth. He saw how the same systems that had silenced the maid now attempted to erase her again, this time by focusing on him. And for the first time, he refused to let that happen. He spoke publicly, not in grand speeches, but in deliberate, uncomfortable honesty. He did not portray himself as a hero. He described himself as complicit. He talked about absence, about silence, about how privilege allows injustice to operate smoothly, because those protected by it rarely feel the consequences. The response was mixed. Some applauded his transparency. Others accused him of exaggeration, of turning a private matter into a moral spectacle. A few insisted that the situation had nothing to do with discrimination at all, that it was simply about professionalism, boundaries, how things work. Marcus recognized those arguments immediately. They were the same ones used everywhere to excuse inequality. Inside the house, staff conversations changed. People spoke more openly, cautiously at first, then with growing confidence. Stories emerged, Small moments of humiliation, quiet dismissals, warnings delivered without witnesses. None of it was dramatic enough to make headlines. All of it was heavy enough to shape lives. The maid listened to these conversations more than she spoke. Her grief remained personal, her loss unchanged. Being acknowledged did not bring her sister back. It did not erase the years of feeling powerless. But it did something else. It broke the isolation. For the first time, she was no longer carrying her story alone. Marcus began to understand that accountability is not a single act, it is a practice. It requires staying present even when attention fades, especially when attention fades. Justice loses its meaning when it only exists under a spotlight. Sebastian's world expanded in subtle but important ways. He spent time around people without hierarchy dictating affection. He learned names. He learned that care could come from many places, and that respect was not something given only upward. These lessons did not come from lectures. They came from observation, from watching adults choose differently. Marcus knew that this was the most lasting impact of all. Because racism and inequality are not inherited through hatred alone, they are passed down through normalized silence, through what children see adults tolerate, through what is left unchallenged. As months passed, Marcus found himself unable to return to the version of life he once accepted. Business decisions felt different. Conversations carried more weight. He began asking questions he had never thought to ask before, not because he wanted credit, but because he could no longer accept ignorance as innocence. He realized something crucial. One moment of courage does not dismantle a system, but it can disrupt it. It can create space for others to speak. It can make silence harder to justify. And slowly, outside the walls of the mansion, echoes of that disruption began to appear, not as sweeping reform, not as sudden change, but as conversations, as discomfort, as people recognizing pieces of their own lives in a story they had initially dismissed as distant. The maid eventually chose to leave the house, not because she was pushed out, but because staying no longer felt necessary to prove anything. She carried her sister's memory with her, not as something stolen, but as something honored. The difference mattered. Marcus watched her go with a deeper understanding of loss. Some wounds do not ask to be healed in the same place they were created. The mansion continued to stand. The business continued to operate. Life moved forward. But something fundamental had shifted. Because once injustice is seen clearly, it changes how everything else is seen too. And Marcus knew this truth would follow him forever. He could never again claim he didn't know.